So I had my cabin in the woods up in Michigan, and I went there in the wintertime, as often as the railroad would allow, sometimes for a few weeks, sometimes, if I was clever, for a few months. A couple times I took a kitten along. Once it was Dordo, another time it was another kitten, whose name I don't recall anymore. They were both good at catching mice, but there were lots of mice around in the woods who would realize, once the cold weather set in, that there was one place nearby with good shelter and warmth and nice soft insulation between the studs of the little house to burrow into and make tunnels and scamper around. So I had plenty of company in the woods, along with my kitten, of whatever name. Skittering, scampering companions. And sometimes I didn't like them scampering across my feet as I slept. And so I thought, now, what other solution could I have beside this little kitten? Because I didn't really enjoy watching the kitten torment these mice after it grew a little older and became a more mature cat capable of true torture. It seems that adults are better at torture than children. Children are amateurs at it. But as we get older, we get much more refined at our torture. And cats are the same way. So I heard about a trap, a kind of trap called a Have-A-Heart Mousetrap. And I bought one at the North Country Co-op in Minneapolis. It was an item built of sheet metal and little bars that were like prison bars in this one compartment. It was about the size of a shoebox. Or no, it was bigger than a shoebox. It was more the size of a boot box. Oh, about yay big. A foot square, maybe. About yay high. And it had, in one side, off-center, a little tunnel running through it, with a hole in the sheet metal on that side, just the size hole a curious, enterprising mouse would want to explore. This had been, presumably, scientifically determined that this was the size hole Mickey or Minnie, wandering around a little woods house, would find irresistible, and it would proceed down this off-center cylinder until the mouse scampered across a little plate, and off to one side of this boot box contraption was a key for winding up a spring that lay underneath this plate. And when the plate sensed Mickey or Minnie on top of it, flip, over it would go, and into prison would go the mouse, into this section on the left side of the whole contraption, where the mouse would not be damaged, would still be a vibrant, fully alive mouse, and he or she would then be calling out piteously to his cousins, sisters, brothers, parents, who knew, to its friends and relations, to come save it from prison. Let me out, let me out. And these others would come along, would hear these cries, and would go down the tunnel. And after a while then, I, the keeper of the zoo, the almighty, the omniscient, kindly person with a heart, the have-a-heart person, unlike the mature kitten who would torment these mice, I would come along, I would find these 3 or 4 mice in my Have-A-Heart Mousetrap. I would put the whole thing under my arm and drive these mice, chauffeur-driven mice, drive them to some other part of the countryside. Let them out behind someone else's house, someone else's barn, or just out in the woods someplace, and release them. I had a heart, and I was releasing these mice into the environment to go live their lives. I was being humane, if that's the term in regard to mice. I don't know. Mice-mane. Anyway, I was releasing the mice into their natural habitat and was not damaging them. I wasn't drowning them. I wasn't breaking their legs with these snap traps. I wasn't getting them glued down or luring them with peanut butter and then killing them one way or another. And I wasn't subjecting them to the awful inventions of my cat. My cat then could be content to sit in my lap and purr, and I, after my own fashion, would purr, and we'd all be happy in the world. The mice, too, would be happy. They would have moved from my warm house to some colder environment somewhere else, of my choosing, the omniscient master of the universe, but they'd be alive. Would they be happy? Would they be as happy as they'd been burrowed into the nice soft insulation of my cabin? Maybe not. I tried not to think about that too much. But I didn't like sweeping up mouse pellets. I didn't like the smell of them, the musty smell of them. I didn't like seeing my kitten torment them. So I had this Have-A-Heart Mousetrap. And when I would go back, after being away 6 or 8 or 9 months, I would crank up the switch again, activate it, and behave as heretofore described. The tragedy occurred when I arrived one year. I think it may have been the fall of 1978. The fall I was saving up the last of my savings on the railroad to prepare to quit the railroad finally after about 5 years of working there off and on and go live south of the border in Costa Rica, which I'd heard had the most beautiful women in the world. This was my friend Alistair told me that. He traveled a lot in Latin America and various other places, and he assured me Costa Rica had the most beautiful women in the world, and also was a good, cheap place to live, but fairly well developed as a country, not as hardscrabble as most areas further south in Latin America. Easier on a North American's tender sensibilities. He thought Costa Rica would be an ideal place for me. I was going to go there and write my railroad novel. Plenty of things had happened to me working on the railroad. I'd seen plenty of things. I'd heard about plenty of things. It had been time for lots of things to work in my head, and a tale was emerging in my head. I was ready to start writing this railroad novel. And in fact, once I'd lived in this particular part of Costa Rica for a while, for a year or so, the people who lived there came to refer to me as Richard Train because I talked about the railroad so much. The railroad far north in Minnesota, where my eyes had once frozen shut working on the job, where I carried the same pocket watch that I still carried with me in Costa Rica, a Hamilton 992B pocket watch that I bought at a pawn shop in St. Paul. I still had that watch. I went on a railroad trip in Costa Rica one time from San Jose across to the Caribbean side of Costa Rica to Limon. And I'd had a discussion in my broken Spanish with the conductor on that train. He hauled out his pocket watch. I hauled out mine. We compared. And I told him about when I had worked on the Ferrocarril in North America, Minnesota. We had quite a meeting of the minds over the idea of this watch. That was important to brakemen regardless of what country you were in. But that all came much later. In the fall of 1978 was the fall I was putting my loose ends together, gathering up my savings, getting an insurance policy that would cover me. And it was a lucky thing I got that insurance policy because I would be operated on in San Jose, Costa Rica. But that, too, was another story. I was getting ready to go away. But I went back to my cabin for the last couple of months. after I quit the railroad. I was feeling good about things there. I'd set up a nice life for myself in the woods. And then, when I arrived, and the kitten, I'm glad to say, was still in my truck, because I wouldn't have wanted my kitten to see what I saw when I came into my cabin and went upstairs, where I left some of my things every time I went away. One of the things I had left behind was my Have-A-Heart Mousetrap. But what I had forgotten to do was either put the Have-A-Heart Mousetrap away in its box and close up the box, or wind down the spring that was fully wound up when I left. Fully wound 6 months earlier. Had gone away and had heartlessly left it there to prey on any number of mice who would come along, see this ideal-sized hole in the wall, and innocently go exploring, get flipped into the prison chamber, call out to its friends and relations to come save it, but no one could save it. And the godly human was not there to save it. The master of the universe had gone away in an indifferent spirit, leaving this torture device behind. The ultimate torture device for mice. And to my horror, I looked inside the enclosure and I saw nothing but mouse bones. Mouse skeletons. It quickly became apparent to me that mice, when desperate, when tortured beyond their endurance, will eat each other. Cannibalistic mice, no different from humans when driven beyond endurance, trying to cross through the snowy gap into California, being snowed in without food and resorting finally to eating the bodies of their loved ones. The Donner Party in the Donner Pass, stuck out in the snowy drifts of Northern California. I'd made that happen to mice in multiple. And when I counted the skeletons, as I felt it my duty to do, I couldn't just sweep them out and ignore these mice skeletons. I counted 22 mouse cadaver skeletons. And only one of these 22 still had its sleek mouse fur in place, because that must have been the 22nd to arrive before the winding went completely down and the torture ended. It may have eaten part of one friend or relation, and no one came along to eat it, its dead or alive body, sitting there in captivity, weakened by starvation. 21 skeletons and one furry, little, hungry, dead body of a mouse. My Have-A-Heart Mousetrap. I didn't wind it up that time to collect mice, those last 2 months of the autumn. I didn't trust myself anymore to be a fair manipulator of this terrible implement. I lived with the mice in a sense of atonement, but I could never atone for those 22. I would watch my cat torture mice. Wouldn't stop it. It was nature playing out. I did not feel superior to nature as I watched my growing kitten learn to torture and torment these poor little mice. I didn't want mice scampering across my ankles as I was trying to sleep. I was selfish. I admitted it. But now I also had to admit that I, in mouse terms, was a monster as well. It wasn't a happy admission to come to, but I had to live with it. Still, I had a pretty good time those couple months. It was a beautiful autumn. The snow started and piled up higher. I went in and out on my snowshoes as I'd done other winters. I cut firewood with my chainsaw. I split the wood with my wood-splitting maul. I had friends up to visit occasionally, but most of the time I was there by myself. I'd go into town to Wakefield in Upper Michigan and visit with my friend Tippy Novak in his clothing store that was still losing money, as it had been for years. Tippy, as always, was my only friend in the area. We would argue politics. That never changed. I didn't spend much time with his family, but I spent a lot of time with him. I would hear little things about his family. He would complain in an amiable way about life at home and the noise of these 4 children and the hectoring of his wife. Now I knew her nickname was Cookie. I'd called her Karen in the past. Tippy said, "No, you must call her Cookie. That's what everyone else calls her." And I couldn't quite bring myself to. I felt a little formal with his wife and could tell that she eyed me a little bit suspiciously, maybe because I sort of wound Tippy up in terms of politics and social issues. In fact, I was on her side of these issues. I hectored Tippy myself. I got at him for not being evolved enough as a man in America in the 1970s. I said, "Now, Tippy, you should be in favor of independence for various women in your family. For your little girl, Jane, you want her to become independent when she grows up, becomes a woman." He said, "I do not. I want her to meet a man who's strong and will take care of her." I thought to myself, like you're strong and take care of Cookie, as you call her. Except he wasn't taking that good care of anyone. He knew that. He would admit it. I didn't say that he didn't take very good care of his wife. We just passed the time in giving each other grief over little political things. He would use words I wouldn't let myself use because I knew they were not polite and acceptable. They were unacceptable words that he used, and he liked to bother me by using them. Just as it was unacceptable for me to mention various sexual possibilities that he didn't want to think about. I would talk about various practices I indulged in and others indulged in of my circle, and he didn't want to hear about those. Oral sex just made him squeamish and off color entirely. He didn't want to hear a thing about that. So I would describe it to him in more detail than he was ready for. I would describe actual incidents and make up others. I'm sure he did the same. We entertained each other. We were good friends. But then, in the middle of December, I did go away. I spent a week or so in Minneapolis, and while I was there, I got a bad cold, I got a fever, and I thought to myself, well, look, I can either be sick here in Minneapolis, it was 10 below outside, or I can make my way to Central America and be sick there and get over my cold there. It'll be 70 degrees there. I can wander around in my shirt sleeves. It'll be a much better place to recover than here. So I made my way, sick as I was, on the train down to Chicago, then on down to New Orleans. The train in Steve Goodman's song described as the city of New Orleans. I took it, but I was in such a fever state that I hardly saw Memphis go past. I hardly saw the Delta country as I rolled into it. But I did have a fairly good time in New Orleans, nonetheless. Was there a day or two. Then I caught a flight to Costa Rica, to San Jose, on the Honduran National Airline, the Stay-at-Home, Stay-Alive airline, SAHSA, SASA. That was the cheapest flight to Costa Rica from New Orleans. I caught it and spent a happy week in Costa Rica, staying at a little inn called the Tala Inn, enfrente de la Casa Amarilla, across from the Yellow House, which was their White House in San Jose, their government headquarters. And my little pension was right there. And in fact, after 2 or 3 days, I found that I had a job as the night clerk at the Tala Inn. And I would stay in Costa Rica for 1.5 years. Had a very good time. Got to know lots of interesting people. I didn't meet the most beautiful woman in the world. In fact, I didn't see the most beautiful women in the world. I had a feeling my friend Alistair had been kidding me, just as he would be years later when he told me the most beautiful women in the world lived in the Dominican Republic, when he wanted me to go stay in his house during the hellacious summer months in the Dominican Republic. When I went back to the States, I had a wedding to go to in Minneapolis. Schmidt and Georgia got married in June, I think, of 1980. I went back to Minneapolis to be there for that wedding. And while I was there, I didn't have a car anymore. I'd sold all my possessions before leaving Minnesota. I talked my friend Pete into driving back up to Wakefield. I wanted to talk to a real estate agent in Ironwood about selling my cabin. Once I'd gotten a taste of living overseas, I wanted to stay overseas. I had it in mind now. I wasn't going to go back to Costa Rica. I was going to go to Ireland for a while. But I needed some money before I went to Ireland. I was about broke at the time of Schmidt's wedding. So I phoned up the real estate agent who had sold me my 80 acres to start with, Pete Eli. Called him. He said, yeah, come on up. We'll talk. I could get a sale all set up for you in advance, in fact. That cabin in the woods, as you've described it to me, would be easy to sell. I can make you $10,000 without a sweat, and you can still have 40 acres of your land. So I was thinking about that. Pete and I started driving across Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin, up toward Ironwood. And we saw this barn. I remember this very specifically. We saw a barn up a hill off in the distance, and it had Ronald Reagan for President painted across it in enormous big letters. I said to Pete, man, somebody went to a lot of work to paint that across his own barn. Is he kidding? Is this a joke? He wants Ronald Reagan to be president? That clown? That California doofus? This guy really wants Ronald Reagan to become president? Pete said to me, you've been out of the country for 1.5 years. I don't think you know what's going on with a lot of the people here now. Ronald Reagan for president is not such a joke as you might think. This was the summer of 1980. Jimmy Carter was going to be the Democratic nominee. We didn't know yet who the Republican nominee would be. I was astonished that anyone could even be considering Ronald Reagan, that C-level actor, that bedtime garbanzo, for president of our country. The guy was a vacuity. I couldn't believe it, let alone go to all the work of painting this across one's own barn out in the country. That really took the cookie for me. But we know about my great powers as a prognosticator. We see how that's worked out, how this country has been about electing clowns as its president, Ronald Reagan now looks kind of mild. But there Pete and I were in Ironwood. And I said, well, since we've come this far, why don't we drive over to Wakefield? I'll say hello to Tippy. Okay, said Pete. Wakefield was only 25 miles away. So we drove over there. We stopped at Tippy's store. The sign wasn't on. I went to the door. The light didn't seem to be on inside. I tried the door to the store. It was locked. That baffled me. It was a weekday. Tippy should have been at his post behind the counter, waiting for the customers who never came, like in a Samuel Beckett play. I peered in the window. It was all dark in there. Things looked a little dusty, but they'd always looked a little dusty, I told myself. Then I thought I would go next door, where Tippy's mother lived. Tippy used to go over there for lunch. Sometimes he'd leave a little sign, a hopeful sign in the window, knock next door and I'll come help you. So I went over to his mother's house. I tried at the door there. I knocked on the door. After a moment, the door was opened to me, opened a kind of crack, and I saw a figure inside. It was not Tippy, and it was not his mother. It was his oldest son, Jeff, was there. And I said, hi, Jeff. Is Tippy here? He said, Dad's not here. He's in jail. He killed Mom. And then he closed the door and vanished into the murky half-dark inside this house. I turned, walked back to Pete's car, let myself in on the passenger side, sat down. What happened? Said Pete. And I said, Tippy's kid just told me that Tippy's in prison. He killed his wife. Did he tell you any details? Pete asked. I said, no. I was never great friends with his children. I don't know them that well. I know this kid's name is Jeff. That's about all I know. And I know that once Tippy killed Jeff's hunting dog in front of Jeff. With his shotgun, he shot him in front of the kid. But now he's killed his wife. He didn't say how, no. And then I was so stunned and unaware of the outside that I was surprised when there came a knocking on the car window next to me. And there stood Tippy's mother. She had seen us sitting in the car, speaking in low tones. She'd seen the astonished looks on our faces and had come out to explain the situation. And as we listened, stone silent, she described what a terrible woman Tippy's wife had been, how it was all her fault, how she had provoked his reactions. And it stunned me that this is how people react to a tragedy. They can't be objective. She loved Tippy, her son. I'd never had a good long talk with her either. I didn't know her. But suddenly, her son had killed this woman, his wife, and she had made sure in her own mind that the tragedy was all the fault of the victim. Her son wasn't a monster. He wasn't a murderer. Tippy, her son, who had been working so hard at keeping this store going all these years. She didn't say how it had happened either. All she could talk about was how it was the wife's fault, Cookie's fault. We thanked her. We did ask her, "Where is Tippy now?" I asked her. And she said, "He's in the prison in Marquette, the maximum security prison. There's no need for him to be in a maximum security prison. He would never do any damage to anyone else. No one else ever provoked him this way. No one touched him off the way she did. It was her fault. I'm very sorry to have to tell you all this. I know you were his friend. I hope you still are." I said, "Of course I am." "Does he get to see visitors at the prison?" She said, "Yes. It's a long drive over there. It's 150 miles. I said, "I know it's far, but we've got this car. We might go." Pete nodded. We could go over there. She went back in her house. Pete started up his car. I said, "Look, would you mind, before we drive over to Marquette, why don't we drive into Ironwood again? We can go to the newspaper there and check around the time it happened and find out what happened before we go see him. We'll be kind of prepared then." So that's what we did. The Ironwood Globe, I believe it was called, was open. We went in. We were able to work out when the murder had occurred. It had been not so long after I had left for Costa Rica in April, late April of 1979. I had left in December of 78. So it had happened only 4 or 5 months after I had left. Tippy had been in jail in Bessemer, the local county jail, and then he'd been at the penitentiary once the trial took place. And the murder weapon had been a baseball bat. He had gone out of his mind and had bludgeoned Cookie to death with a baseball bat. The only witness, the newspaper said, and it didn't say at what point in this proceeding, but the only witness had been their oldest son, Jeff, who'd seen Tippy kill his rabbit hunting dog in front of him, had seen Tippy beat his mother's brains out with a baseball bat. In the middle of the night, on April 26th or whenever it was, 1979. Having learned these details, Pete and I turned his car around and drove the 150 miles east to Marquette, Michigan, in the heart of the Upper Peninsula. And the next day, we went and visited little Tippy Novak, the mild-looking friend of mine who had been so good to me, who'd offered me his store back room to live in when the weather had gotten too cold for me to live in the woods in my tent, who'd sold me various clothes at such high discounts I felt like a thief, even trying to talk him up in price. I felt bad for giving him so little, but he wouldn't accept any more. Who had invited me to his home on Christmas Day when I'd been neglected by my girlfriend, who was no longer my girlfriend, and my heart was broken. On the Christmas of 1975, Tippy, who'd been so good to me. We sat at opposite sides of the table, Pete and I on one side, Tippy on the other. I asked him how he was getting along there. We were talking in very low voices. No one else could hear us. I said, "Most of the prisoners here seem to be black, Tippy." He said, "Yes, 98% of them, I think he said. They're all from Detroit. Terrible people." He didn't use the word, the N-word, then, but I knew he was thinking it. He said, they leave me alone, though, because they call me a bug, because I bugged out. They call me a bug and they leave me alone. They're scared of what I might do. You? I said. He said, well, if I did it once, they don't know what I might do again. We didn't talk long. I didn't bring up politics and Ronald Reagan to him. He would have been a happy voter for Ronald Reagan, no doubt, with his dog whistle racist terms for bringing out the rage of white voters. Ronald Reagan, who would open his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the code for racism. And yet there was no point in bringing up politics, social issues, oral sex, all the fun topics we had tossed back and forth in the old days. Pete and I turned and left. Tippy went away to wherever it was he spent his time, in the Marquette Penitentiary. I would write to him from Ireland, I think only once. I wasn't such a virtuous person as I sometimes like to think of myself. I should have written all the time. Later on, when I lived in Minnesota again, I should have gone to visit him, either in prison or years later when he was released and was back in Wakefield, living, I suppose, at his mother's house. I don't know if he reopened the store or not. I never went back to see Tippy, my best friend up there. And the thing that came back to me when Pete and I were driving west from Marquette, then through Ironwood, and then back down to our safe, liberal lives in the Twin Cities, the thing that came back to me for some reason was my Have-A-Heart Mousetrap. What I didn't seem to consider until after the fact, what no one ever seems to consider until after the fact, was the law of unintended consequences. I bought a Have-A-Heart Mousetrap, and I ended up tormenting a huge family of mice, cousins, brothers, sister mice, Minnie and Mickey, and all their cousins. I had tortured and murdered in my own way. I felt like somehow maybe I had touched off Tippy in ways I never anticipated. You set in motion a long train of events without knowing that you're even a part of setting it in motion. People who voted for Ronald Reagan were setting in train the election of Donald Trump. Donald Jackanapes Trump. I kept wondering if there had been warning signs I should have heeded, if I should have known something. The newspaper in Ironwood said that Tippy was upset because his wife wanted to go off and get a job and make money so that the family would have a better income, so that they would have more money for their children. They could live better. And she had gotten a job at the post office, and he had been enraged by this. It had challenged his manhood in his own mind. She had gotten a separation, a legal separation from him, maybe a divorce. She had also gotten a restraining order from a judge telling Tippy that he couldn't come within 500 feet of their house or something like that. And obviously he had disregarded that. He had been waiting for her inside their home. He had broken in somehow in the middle of the night and had been waiting for her when she had come home from a date with some other man. That was how I worked it out in my head. She came home around 2 a.m. He was out of his mind with rage, with jealousy. Out of his mind. Was there anything I could have done His mother hadn't asked that, but I'm sure she had asked herself when she wasn't defending him and attacking her. And I certainly asked myself that a lot as we were driving back to Minneapolis. And I brought up this Have-A-Heart Mousetrap. Pete said, "You don't mean to tell me that you think you killed her just because you weren't there to stop him from doing it?" No, I don't mean that exactly. I just mean, I don't know. I've got this queasy feeling about the whole thing. I don't feel good about any of it. I wasn't at all sorry when Pete Eli contacted me. I was still in Minneapolis. I was going to leave a few days later, and he said, "Yes, I have a buyer for you. Would you be interested in $10,000 for your cabin and that 40 that it sits on?" I said, "Yes, definitely. Please send me the forms. I'll send it back to you." Because this safe place in the woods I had built for myself didn't feel safe anymore. And I wasn't sure I was an agent of safety for others after what I'd done with that Have-A-Heart Mousetrap. And after the life of my friend Tippy Novak had taken the turn it had, I wasn't as convinced as his mother that it was all Cookie Novak's fault. I had a feeling it wasn't. And I wondered where I stood in the whole thing. I still wonder, all these years later. A few months ago, I came across Tippy's obituary online. I didn't have to go up to Ironwood in this modern age to find his obituary. I fed in his name, his nickname, Tippy, and there it popped up. It mentioned that both his parents had predeceased him. It said that his wife had predeceased him. Gave her name. It said when she had predeceased him. It did not say how she had. It said he was a proud member of the VFW and had been buried with full veterans honors in the local cemetery. And that's all I know about how that part of that story ended up. He was 84 years old when he died. I was stunned at how old he was, how much older than I he was. He had seemed so young and so innocent.